Part 5. He took a step, closed the door behind him mechanically, and remained standing, noting what he saw. It was a large hall, dimly lighted and noisy and silent by turns, where all the machinery of a criminal trial was exhibited, with its petty yet solemn gravity, before the multitude. At one end of the hall, that at which he found himself, heedless judges in threadbare robes were biting their fingernails or closing their eyelids. At the other end was a ragged rabble. There were lawyers in all sorts of attitudes, soldiers with honest and hard faces, old stained wainscoting, a dirty ceiling, tables covered with serge, which was more nearly yellow than green, doors blackened by finger marks, tavern lamps giving more smoke than light, on nails in the panelling, candles in brass candlesticks on the tables, everywhere obscurity, unsightliness, and gloom. And from all this there arose an austere and august impression, for men felt therein the presence of that great human being which is called law, and that great divine thing which is called justice. No man in this multitude paid any attention to him. All eyes converged on a single point, a wooden bench placed against a little door, along the wall at the left hand of the judge. Upon this bench, which was lighted by several candles, was a man between two gendarmes. This was the man. He did not look for him. He saw him. His eyes went toward him naturally, as if they had known in advance where he was. He thought he saw himself, older doubtless, not precisely the same in features, but alike in attitude and appearance, with that bristling hair, with those wild and restless eyeballs, with that blouse just as he was on the day he entered Dean, full of hatred, and concealing in his soul that hideous hoard of frightful thoughts which he had spent 19 years in gathering upon the floor of the galleys. He said to himself with a shudder, "Great God, shall I again come to this?" This being appeared at least 60 years old. There was something indescribably rough, stupid, and terrified in his appearance. At the sound of the door, people had stood aside to make room. The judge had turned his head, and supposing the person who entered to be the mayor of Montreuil-sur-Mer, greeted him with a bow. The prosecuting attorney, who had seen Madeleine at Montreuil-sur-Mer, whither he had been called more than once, by duties of his office, recognized him and bowed likewise. He scarcely perceived them. He gazed about him, a prey to a sort of hallucination. Judges, clerk, gendarme, a throng of heads, cruelly curious. He had seen all these once before, 27 years ago. He had fallen again upon these fearful things. They were before him. They moved. They had being. It was no longer an effort of his memory, a mirage of his fancy, but real gendarmes and real judges, a real throng and real men of flesh and bone. It was done. He saw reappearing and living again around him, with all the frightfulness of reality, the monstrous visions of the past. All this was yawning before him. Stricken with horror, he closed his eyes and exclaimed from the depths of his soul, "Never!" And by a tragic sport of destiny, which was agitating all his ideas and rendering him almost insane, it was another self before him. This man on trial was called by all around him Jean Valjean. He had before his eyes an unheard of vision, a sort of representation of the most horrible moment of his life, played by his shadow. All, everything was there. The same paraphernalia, the same hour of the night, almost the same faces, judge and assistant judges, soldiers and spectators, but above the head of the judge was a crucifix, a thing which did not appear in courtrooms at the time of his sentence. When he was tried, God was not there. A chair was behind him. He sank into it, terrified at the idea that he might be observed. When seated, he took advantage of a pile of papers on the judge's desk to hide his face from the whole room. He could see now, without being seen. He entered fully into the spirit of the reality. By degrees he recovered his composure, and arrived at that degree of calmness at which it is possible to listen. Monsieur Madeleine was one of the jurors. He looked for Javert, but did not see him. The witness's seat was hidden from him by the clerk's table, and then, as we have just said, the hall was only dimly lighted. At the moment of his entrance, the counsel for the prisoner was finishing his plea. The attention of all was excited to the highest degree. The trial had been in progress for 3 hours. During these 3 hours, the spectators had seen a man, an unknown wretched being, thoroughly stupid or thoroughly artful, gradually bending beneath the weight of a terrible probability. He made gestures and signs which signified denial, or he gazed at the ceiling. He spoke with difficulty and answered with embarrassment, but from head to foot his whole person denied the charge. He seemed like an idiot in the presence of all these intellects raged in battle around him, and like a stranger in the midst of this society by whom he had been seized. Nevertheless, a most threatening future awaited him. Probabilities increased every moment, and every spectator was looking with more anxiety than himself for the calamitous sentence which seemed to be hanging over his head with ever increasing surety. One contingency even gave a glimpse of the possibility, beyond the galleys, of a capital penalty should his identity be established, and the Petit Gervais affair result in his conviction. Who was this man? What was the nature of his apathy? Was it imbecility or artifice? Did he know too much, or nothing at all? These were questions upon which the spectators took sides, and which seemed to affect the jury. There was something fearful and something mysterious in the trial. The drama was not merely gloomy, but it was obscure. The counsel for the defence had made a very good plea in the provincial language which long constituted the eloquence of the bar, and which was formerly employed by all lawyers at Paris as well as Romoratin or Montbrison, but which, having now become classic, is used by few except the official orators of the bar, whom it suited by its solemn rotundity and majestic periods. A language in which husband and wife are called spouses, Paris the centre of arts and civilization, the king the monarch, a bishop a holy pontiff, the prosecuting attorney the eloquent interpreter of the vengeance of the law, arguments the accents which we have just heard, the time of Louis XIV, the illustrious age, a theatre the temple of Melpomene, the reigning family, the august blood of our kings, a concert, a musical solemnity, the general in command, the illustrious warrior who, etc., students of theology, those tender Levites, mistakes imputed to newspapers, the imposture which distills its venom into the columns of these organs, etc., etc. The counsel for the defence had begun by expatiating on the theft of the apples, a thing ill-suited to a lofty style, but benign Bossuet himself was once compelled to make allusion to a hen in the midst of a funeral oration, and acquitted himself with dignity. The counsel established that the theft of the apples was not in fact proved. His client, whom in his character of counsel he persisted in calling Champmathieu, had not been seen to scale the wall or break off the branch. He had been arrested in possession of this branch, which the counsel preferred to call bough, but he said that he had found it on the ground. Where was the proof to the contrary? Undoubtedly this branch had been broken and carried off after the scaling of the wall, then thrown away by the alarmed marauder. Undoubtedly there had been a thief, but what evidence was there that this thief was Champmathieu? One single thing, that he was formerly a convict. The counsel would not deny that this fact unfortunately appeared to be fully proved, but even supposing him to be the convict Jean Valjean, did this prove he had stolen the apples? That was a presumption at most, not a proof. The accused, it was true, and the counsel in good faith must admit it, had adopted a mistaken system of defence. He had persisted in denying everything, both the theft and the fact that he had been a convict. An avowal on the latter point would have been better certainly, or would have secured to him the indulgence of the judges. The counsel had advised him to this course, but the defendant had obstinately refused, expecting probably to escape punishment entirely by admitting nothing. It was a mistake, but must not the poverty of his intellect be taken into consideration? The man was evidently imbecile. Long-suffering in the galleys, long-suffering out of the galleys had brutalized him, etc. If he made a bad defence, was this a reason for convicting him? As to the Petit Gervais affair, the counsel had nothing to say. It was not in the case. He concluded by entreating the jury and court, if the identity of Jean Valjean appeared evident to them, to apply him to the police penalties prescribed for breaking of ban, and not the fearful punishment decreed to the convict found guilty of a second offence. The prosecuting attorney replied to the counsel for the defence. He was violent and flowery, like most prosecuting attorneys. He complimented the counsel for his frankness, of which he shrewdly took advantage. He attacked the accused through all the concessions which his counsel had made. The counsel seemed to admit that the accused was Jean Valjean. He accepted the admission. This man, then, was Jean Valjean. This fact was conceded to the prosecution, and could be no longer contested. Who was Jean Valjean? Description of Jean Valjean, a monster vomited, etc. The auditory and the jury shuddered. This description finished, the prosecuting attorney resumed with an oratorical burst, designed to excite the enthusiasm of the Journal de la Préfecture to the highest pitch the next morning. And it is such a man, etc., etc., a vagabond, a mendicant, without means of existence, etc., accustomed through his existence to criminal acts, and profiting little by his past life in the galleys, as is proved by the crime committed on Petit Gervais. It is such a man who, found on the highway in the very act of theft, a few paces from a wall that had been scaled, still holding in his hand the subject of his crime, denies the act in which he is caught, denies the theft, denies the escalade, denies everything, denies even his name, denies even his identity, besides 100 other proofs to which we will not return. He is identified by 4 witnesses: Javert, the incorruptible inspector of police, Javert and 3 of his former companions in disgrace, the convicts Brevet, Chenildieu, and Cochepaille. What has he to oppose this overwhelming unanimity? His denial. What depravity! You will do justice, gentlemen of the jury, etc. While the prosecuting attorney was speaking, the accused listened open-mouthed, with a sort of astonishment, not unmingled with admiration. He was evidently surprised that a man could speak so well. From time to time, at the most forcible parts of the argument, at those moments when eloquence, unable to contain itself, overflows in a stream of withering epithets, and surrounds the prisoner like a tempest, he slowly moved his head from right to left, and from left to right, a sort of sad, mute protest, from which he contented himself with the beginning of the argument. 2 or 3 times, the spectators nearest him heard him say in a low tone, "This all comes from not asking for Monsieur Baloup." The prosecuting attorney pointed out to the jury this air of stupidity, which was evidently put on, and which denoted not imbecility, but address, artifice, and the habit of deceiving justice, and which showed in its full light the deep-rooted perversity of the man. He concluded by reserving entirely the Petit Gervais affair, and demanding a sentence to the full extent of the law. This was, for this offence, as will be remembered, hard labour for life. The counsel for the prisoner rose, commenced by complimenting Monsieur, the prosecuting attorney, on his admirable argument, then replied as best he could, but in a weaker tone. The ground was evidently giving way under him.